Welcome to Slash Forward. Imagine witnessing a celestial object touching down not too far from your house. In the subsequent days, you come to the unfortunate realization that your parents are no longer your parents, whether they've been replaced or just taken over by some other entity. In your zeal to return to some semblance of normalcy, you attempt to uncover the cause of and solution to your problems. Except your options and resources are severely limited and no one believes you, because you're just a dumb kid. What would you do if you found yourself in such a situation? And how would you go about conquering the unknown? We'll be examining this, and in so doing, uncover a variety of helpful rules and strategies that would serve you well in a variety of alien invasion scenarios. By unpacking the events that unfold and mistakes made in Tobe Hooper's 1986 film Invaders From Mars. Be sure to leave a comment to share your own strategies for saving your hometown, while either including or excluding the concordant survival of your parents, depending on your preference. Let's get to it. We open on George Gardner taking in the majesty of the universe with his son David. As a NASA employee, he's so enamored with the poetry of the spheres that he demonstrates a reckless disregard for his cardigan. Ellen comes out to announce bedtime, which is undermined by George, but they otherwise have a good thing going here. As they complete their evening rituals and settle into bed, George gives David a fresh new penny for his collection. An astronomer and a penny nerd? This dude reeks of unquenchable sexual energy, my friends. Then it's off to bed. The meteors calm down, but then the storms roll in. As David goes to shut his window, he bears witness to a gigantic strobing meteor touching down nearby, which sends him off screaming. Unfortunately, by the time they return to his room, it's descended below the crest of Copper Hill, so they disregard his concerns and agree to take a look in the morning instead. The evening's excitement has dissipated by the morning. However, David does begin to wonder about his father's unusually dazed and confused demeanor, but George has a way
It was just a bad dream.
of really putting you at ease, like the way he refuses to address the newly developed navel on his neck, and how he's taken to lacing his coffee with crystal meth before guzzling the piping hot brew like an absolute mad lad. Then, when walking his boy to the bus, George does confirm that he found something interesting on the other side of the hill when he went to check. But David decides that he's all good for now. At school, while the children prepare to murder Mrs. McKelch's fresh marshland victims, David gets into a frog tossing competition. As one would expect, it ends in bloodshed, requiring David to be escorted to the school nurse. McKelch drags him in, hoping for some reciprocal henpecking, but storms off in the face of Miss Magnuson's calm, compassionate demeanor. After school, David returns home to find the house open due to a malfunction with the automatic door. With everything quiet, he naturally starts watching a matinee showing of Life Force, but his prankster mom interrupts him before he can get to the naked parts. He confides that Dad had been acting like a fairly odd bird that day, but they don't both begin to worry until he fails to show up that evening. Ellen ends up calling the police, who decide to go check out Copper Hill just to see if maybe he's out smoking a joint with the high schoolers. But right after they leave, George pops out with Ed, his equally strange bro from work. They appear to have hit happy hour hard as hell because Ed staggers off toward home, sans vehicle. Then the police return and they all monotonally comment on David's abundant imagination as regards the prior evening's celestial phenomenon. It's not until after dinner that Ellen takes notice of George's strange behavior. Then, in the night, he comes in to steal David's penny collection while he pretends to be asleep. Later, the two lovers stroll off into the mist, and David laments what he recognizes to be the loss of his mother. He gets confirmation of this the next morning when Ellen pulls a little skin flap off her neck and has suddenly lost all her bacon skills. She takes his reluctance as a sign he needs some fresh air and suggests they all have a little picnic over the hill at the sand pit. David seems to be struggling with the implications here.
Is this a joke?
While Ellen whips up a batch of her patented salted beef patties for breakfast. They then offer a strange goodbye as he heads out to the bus. At lunch that day, he catches a private conversation about some sort of destruction scheduled for midnight, and that old Daddy George has been delegated to participate. He then peeps on McKelch for some more juicy deets, picking up on the fact that she's sporting a fresh neck bandage. Thirsty for news, he ventures into her inner sanctum where he catches her feasting on the class project. She tries to catch him but pulls a stitch because her swollen belly is practically bursting with frog meat. He manages to find a sympathetic ear in Linda, and she attempts to build a rapport, but he insists on inspecting her neck first. He finds it supple, firm, and unmarred, so he unpacks the story of what led him to her office that day. When he finishes, she gives a little giggle, confirming adults cannot be trusted. But Linda attempts to leverage her nursing authority to try to get a look at McKelch's neck wound, and her responses are both evasive and more aggressive than typical, causing some concern. She is shaken enough to send David out the window with a key to her house where she plans to meet him after school. After he leaves, Linda brushes off Heather, who has come looking for David and is sporting a similar neck bandage, all but confirming his story. David attempts to escape but is soon pinned down from all sides. Luckily, there is an innocent van nearby with an open door. Unluckily, it belongs to McKelch and is occupied by her collection of wayward animals. She drives until arriving at a trailhead where she stops for a vigorous afternoon hike. David follows her in the hope that it will lead him to some intel, but the trail leads into a series of tunnels with limited cover, so he's running a big risk here. Regardless, he pursues her into the steamy inner sanctum, and it pays off because he peeps the master brain, which communicates through a little dangly bit that pops out of the victim's neck holes. McKelch does a quick vowel check before acknowledging David's presence. Fortunately for him, the Martians were not ready for the agility of youth. He runs out of there and heads straight to Linda's house, where they both lay low until danger passes. When the coast is clear, he leads her back to the tunnel, which is now missing. They must have packed up and moved, just in case a young boy were to return with the school nurse. With the consequences of stealing away with a boy half her age now weighing on her, Linda begins to succumb to her doubts. But before she can return him to his home, they witness Mr. Gardner directing a couple of fresh victims over the hill, providing them the chance to see how the sausage gets made. Now they're fully committed, so Linda heads into town and stops at the first payphone to ring the state police. But before she can, Mrs. McKelch rolls up in her bus and starts grabbing at David. Linda scoops him up and diverts now to her new plan, which is to call the FBI. From the school? But they drive all the way out there only to discover that the phone lines are dead, and then the police roll up. Now it's David's turn to come up with something, and he leads Linda to his favorite hiding spot for when he wants to get away from it all, the boiler room. The police eventually make it back to where they are, so David gives her a shh, quiet bitch. But they do get found because they weren't really hiding. The officers weren't expecting it to be this easy, so they get overexcited and fail to get their shots off before the ground erupts with an intergalactic strobe light. On the way out, Linda wants to flee the whole town, but David is still encumbered by a nostalgic attachment to his parents. So his next move is to head to the military base where his dad works to get a meeting with General Wilson. As it turns out, being George Gardner's son has some benefits, as they're soon welcomed deep into the bosom of the encampment. After a couple of quick neck checks, they get to spilling the beans. As they do so, George arrives with a bomb, and the aliens' plan, whatever that may be, is initiated. When we circle back, we find the general incredulous, but there were strange phenomena in the sky the prior night, beyond the expected meteor shower. Being a man of measured action, the general needs to think this over, so he sends them off to the briefing room while he initiates a routine security check on the NASA boys. But at the mere mention of Copper Hill, they draw down on him. Luckily, his right-hand man is always at the ready, and he does not hesitate to put some ninjutsu on their bodies. Before they can reveal anything of the Martian plan, their overlord hits the self-destruct button on him. In light of this new information, the general then calls for a complete lockdown of the base. Meanwhile, the truck is making its way toward the launch pad and completely disregards the freeze order. The military and NASA scientists then watch in horror as the plan comes to fruition, keep the primates from poking around on the surface of Mars. Now looking to counterstrike, security starts popping off and the general sends troops to the school while requesting David lead another group toward the tunnel openings. Soon, soldiers are swarming like ants, pouring in all over the place, knocking down fences and descending into various tunnels and holes they happen to find in the area. David thinks of his parents and broaches the topic of diplomacy. But they've already reached into the tool bag and selected a hammer, so it's time for the boys to step aside and let the men do their work, frolicking around in the sand. While underground, a couple of sentinels emerge and it's just too much for Dr. Weinstein. He attempts to make contact and presumes they've reached some level of understanding, but he must have missed a couple of contextual clues because they then vaporize his ass. On the plus side, the soldiers do confirm the Martians are susceptible to gunfire and explosion. Topside, David has made the determination that if he wants a chance at extracting his parents, he has no real choice other than to go in the one way they know is possible, and he goes for it. This prompts the men to attempt to blast their way in, winching themselves out of the twirling mass but leaving behind an explosive payload. This provides a gaping hole the men may enter. Meanwhile, apparently unaware of the excitement above, David watches in horror as a soldier resting his head on a silicone ball sack has his control module inserted. David's then brought before the Supreme Intelligence, who he tries to reason with in order to secure the return of his loved ones. But these visitors from the heavens are unconcerned with the petty human concept of personal relationships. With his anger boiling over, David penny sacks McKelch straight into a Martian's mouth, who decides not to overlook its gifted meal as David runs back for the tunnels. David runs across a couple of guards and observes how they prep their vaporizers. They then cross paths with the gun boys who take them out. David leads them back to the needle machine where it's open season on killing Martians, who mostly stand around and take it, making for a quick victory. After saving Linda from penetration, they set some explosive charges and attempt to get out of there before the ship takes off. They find the way to be blocked, but David has the idea to use the alien tech to re-gape the hole. Remembering that he learned it's fueled by copper, we get a call back to David's rare penny from the beginning of the movie, and he uses his greasy little fingers to greedily cram it into the slot. As they filter out, he's distracted by the reappearance of his parents, who try to convince him that hanging out in tunnels is a cool thing to do. In a turn of good fortune, him running from them also leads them out of the blast radius. The explosion of the ship then also deactivates their neck needles. But then David wakes up suddenly, confused and scared. After a quick confirmation that he is in the real world now, they get him calm and back to bed. But then, like a true hustler, ya boy turns his dreams into reality. How delightfully nostalgic that was. A Golden Globus-produced Tobe Hooper film. It can barely get more 80s than that. As we look through the lessons learned here, we're going to be walking away with a lot of general lessons that will be useful in everyday life. Because here, we're mainly looking at a problem of persuasion. We all know that a simple grade schooler would be unable to handle a Martian horde on his own. Success is really dependent on his ability to unlock his still burgeoning charisma to bring people on board with him. It's less about brute force and figuring out how to kill aliens, and more about convincing others that there's a problem to address, and how to curry favor and marshal the forces in order to save all that they hold dear. The first step here is recognition. He saw something unusual in the night sky, but gets no confirmation of what it was. George just agrees to take a look in the morning. When David comes down, there is evidence that George had already been there. He doesn't mention it specifically until later, but he is missing one of his loafers, implying that he lost the other in a muddy hike over the hill. This should be a moment of peak curiosity and information gathering. Why not casually inquire about their plan for checking out the Earthbound meteor? In the course of this questioning, it may become more apparently obvious that something is wrong with your dad. With only minimal conversation, there were clear indicators that he was obviously having a hard time keeping it together. Pressing the conversation and forcing him into more interaction would go a long way in confirming any suspicions. The main thing to take away from this is to always be wary of a dad with an inconsistent routine. George has likely been wearing the same clothes, telling the same jokes, and engaging in the same morning ritual for at least the last 10 years. Any sudden change alone is cause for suspicion, but the apathy toward the loss of his leather house shoe and clear indication of unspecified physical trauma should be raising significant alarms. This is confirmed later when a clear break in his schedule was worrisome enough to prompt Ellen to call the police. The police were already fairly strange on their own, but when they come back holding their necks, we now have a second indicator that is stronger than the first, in that it goes beyond simple behavioral observation. With George, there was a break in routine, but what of the other town weirdos? You would have to develop some sort of method to gauge strangeness, which would rely too heavily on subjective measures. However, with this new objective physical indicator, you're in business, the business of inspecting necks. Of course, in order for this to be meaningful, you would have to have the mental grit to push through the coping stages to reach acceptance as quickly as possible. David's inability to do this, despite the abundance of evidence early on, resulted in him losing his mother to the Horde. The primary negative impact of this is the fact that he does not appear to have any other trustworthy adults in his social circle. So now he has the disadvantage of trying to figure out who he can confide in. As a child approaching adults, this can be very intimidating and presents a high likelihood of failure since you'll be starting from a negative position, as aside from the risk of choosing the wrong one to approach, most adults would be unlikely to take you seriously in the first place. However, this could be turned to your advantage. As you begin to gather intel and try to ascertain exactly what the threat is, you may find yourself with greater opportunities to enter areas that may be off limits to others by presenting yourself as an unassuming child. This is an important step because the more specifics you have, the more believable your story will be when others hear it. The key characteristic here is to get to the point where you know and accept that something is wrong, but pretend like it's all good. Feigning ignorance or playing stupid is a strong strategy. Properly employed, it will allow you to overstep and risk mistakes while minimizing negative outcomes, as your actions will likely be interpreted as an innocent misunderstanding. However, this does require you not to plunge too deep. When David pursues Mikkel, she follows her into her closet. Instead of observing from the doorway where he can slip away or play off his presence as just seeking to ask her a quick question, he ventures well into the closet with no cover. Once she turns around, he's toast. So unless he intended to physically confront her here, there's no reason for him to delve this far. And after he's sighted, his cover is now blown. Everything from this point must be full espionage. He's lost both the element of surprise and his ability to wander about, appearing as a babe in the woods, so to speak. Now finding an ally is of the utmost importance. David happening upon Linda and the path they took towards solidarity was ultimately a sequence of circumstances that unfolded through sheer luck. Ideally, you would have some familiarity with the person you approach first. I would have liked for David to have carved out a little time beforehand to explore what was on the other side of Copper Hill. Ultimately, it turned out there was nothing to see other than a sand pit, so that may not have helped him, but he didn't know that at the time. If you're thinking ahead and taking steps toward achieving your goal, you should really be focused on finding a way to shine a light on the dangers you've identified. Whoever you approach is going to have to swallow a pill that could choke a horse. Your best approach is to find some innocuous way to get them to a point where they see what you've seen, so they have no choice but to believe you. In this case, he lucked into the neck bandage thing, because if there hadn't been more than one of them, this would have been a meaningless detail. Then, the tunnel entrance disappearing was another huge miss. Everything was on the verge of falling apart until they happened to bear witness to an actual abduction. This was a huge turning point that almost didn't happen due to David's lack of preparation. In regards to his actual intel gathering, this was also high risk and sloppy. The smooth tunnels provided no cover or places to hide. He basically had to stand out in the open the entire time. But in terms of actual intel, the trip was entirely wasted. He learned that the Martians are very vascular, but slow, which is good to know. The leader of the group is a giant squishy brain, which would likely be very susceptible to physical damage. However, it speaks in a Martian language that he can't understand, so he doesn't learn any more than that, and then he doesn't actually relay any of the information he did learn to anyone else throughout the movie. After all the time and effort that goes into finding and confiding in an accomplice, you have to also bring them into the loop. Everyone should be working off of the same information, just in case the group gets split up or some other hardship befalls you. At this point, the best option is to likely get out of town entirely so you can get a broader perspective on what's going on and possible next steps. Instead of doing this, David wants to try to find his mom and dad, which should be a huge mistake. You have to deal with the core problem before moving on to secondary issues, especially when the core problem involves your parents' brains being completely overrun. Regardless, this happens to work out in their favor yet again, because George works for NASA at a base that is independently secured by Marine forces. He was able to bring them on his side quickly when the pod folks basically showed their whole asses right in front of the general, and just before a full display of their power and intent went right off in their faces. This is highly situational and lucky on their part. Again, not knowing who has been taken over, but knowing the police have been infiltrated, you'd be better off moving out of town to find help. So it may be of benefit to grab you one of those school children to take along as evidence in case you have trouble convincing outsiders of your plight. Once you've returned in force, there was a question of negotiation versus aggression. It's understandable that David was concerned for the well-being of his parents, but the Martians had shown nothing but aggression so far. This is further confirmed by Weinstein's fate in the tunnels. There's clearly no interest in communication, although in fairness, he was talking to a couple of grunts, and they're not the decision makers. But what are the odds of getting a meeting with the Supreme Intelligence if every other Martian you run across tries to vaporize you? No, this was basically the correct strat. They went in hard and got the job done in the end. The only real criticism I would have here is they pulled back too soon. I'm not sure why the primary objective was to detonate the entire ship, as it was likely full of useful alien technology. Imagine if we had gotten smartphones 10 years earlier, where we'd be now. They should have stuck to the guns and not let up as easily as they did. Any veteran Contra player knows that this is only the Master Brain's first phase. There will likely be 1 to 3 more phases after this. If you have sufficient ammo and patience, you'll eventually make your way through them all, thereby eliminating the threat and retaining all that precious technology for yourself. Finally, there's the question of whether any of this matters at all, since David ultimately woke up, revealing this to be a dream. To that, I would have to say this obviously matters. The dream was a dry run. When he woke up, the loop was initiated in real life. So if he had been introspective about his faults, he was presented a chance to correct everything. Given the state of the news recently, I find it hard to imagine that anyone would dismiss the importance of this type of exercise. But you are free to do so at your own peril. Before we go, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my donors memorialized in the Hall of Headshots. I have a website set up where you can support the channel through donations or merch. Any donation unlocks uncensored movie reviews of Life Force and Under the Skin, with others to be added over time. And if you enjoyed the video, I would love for you to become part of the channel by subscribing. Thanks for watching.